I'm very pleased today to introduce the 13th Revell Lecturer, Dr. Eddie Bernard, Scientist Emeritus of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's PMEL Lab, so the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, and an affiliate professor at the University of Washington. Dr. Bernard retired as director of PMEL in 2010 after 40 years of service at NOAA. His noted career spanned a broad range of research programs, including climate dynamics, fisheries oceanography, El Nino forecast, underwater volcanoes. It'll be down by the time I finish. And of course, tsunamis. So Dr. Bernard served as director of NOAA's Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Honolulu for 3 years. And then following a tsunami in the Sea of Japan in 1993, he led a U.S. team that surveyed the extent of the damage from that tsunami, and also served as a founding chairman of the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program and chairman of the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics Tsunami Commission. Dr. Bernard has published more than 85 papers and served as editor for 3 books focusing on tsunamis. He's received numerous awards for outstanding performance and service, including 3 Presidential Meritorious Rank Awards. As he'll discuss, I'm sure, in his presentation today, the 2004 tsunami caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and widespread devastation. And then just over a year ago, of course, we were reminded about the enormous threats caused by tsunamis when Japan suffered more than 20,000 deaths and about $200 billion in economic loss. So this is something that we should all pay attention to here in the U.S. as well. As NOAA tells us, more than half of the United States population now lives within 50 miles of the coast. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Eddie Bernard, who will present Tsunamis, Are We Underestimating the Risk?
It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Tony for inviting me to this wonderful auditorium. I look forward to having a discussion with you about tsunamis this afternoon. Basically, I think the answer to this question, I'll be up front, is yes, we are. But we're underestimating the risk of all natural hazards because of the way we approach natural hazards in this country. We think of it in terms of actuarial tables, like we would do if you're an insurance company, where you have millions of people that you could sample from. You can start to develop statistical properties about how much you charge to insure for one. When you deal with tsunamis, it's a rare event, and you don't have much statistical data to do it with. So trying to project what the risk is gives you large uncertainties. In fact, the uncertainties are so great that many people would argue that they're not anywhere, they're not understood or even known. So I think what we've seen in the last 10 years is 2 major tsunamis, one in the Indian Ocean, which killed 237,000 people in a matter of 4 hours. And then what we witnessed last year in a developed country, the most tsunami prepared country in the world, lose 20,000 people. So if Japan isn't prepared, what should we be thinking about? So that's the concept behind today's discussion. Like Jeff pointed out, I'm Scientist Emeritus, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so I no longer represent NOAA, so all these comments today are based on my personal opinions, which is a great thing to say to an audience. Okay, so today we'll talk about, I have three parts to this talk. One is Tsunami Signs. The Roger Revell lecture was designed so that we could talk about science and how science could impact policy. Many of the laws that we pass in our country are based on information. A lot of them have to do with legal implications, moral implications, but a subset of those laws have to do with scientific information. And Roger Revell was famous for trying to incorporate those principles into policy. So that's what I'll talk about, how the science that we're learning has been incorporated in policy, and then what do we do next. Okay, so let's talk about tsunami science. Tsunamis can be generally characterized as having 3 stages. It's generated by some disturbance of the seafloor that creates a disturbance on the surface of the ocean. It propagates and then floods. Pretty simple. I'd like to illustrate this by this animation. And this is a tsunami source for the 2011 Fukushima tsunami. And then this square box becomes this part of the land, and then this square box becomes this other land. So you telescope down. This is the coastline of Japan. This is a finer view of it, and then here's the view. So let's watch what happens. Here's the disturbance that generated the tsunami. And we'll watch it propagate to the coastline. See, it comes across very quickly, and once it hits the coastline, it starts to flood. And you can see all this flooding taking place. And now watch all this interaction between waves bouncing around, and actually later waves come in and push the water further inland because it hasn't had time to drain away. So several characteristics about this that are different about tsunamis is the inundation depends on the local topography. If it's low lands like here, you have great penetration. If it's very steep hills like up here, you have very little flooding. So those are the characteristics of this that makes it so difficult to forecast, is that it could, within very short distances, you could have great flooding like here, and down here, you have very little flooding. So it's all about flooding. That's what you have to keep in mind, because that's where the tsunami and society come into contact. Okay, so let's now look at this flooding aspect in more detail. And this is a video that was taken by an NHK helicopter as the tsunami was flooding the Tohoku area. NHK has, at every airport in Japan, helicopters standing by to videotape disasters such as this. And as you can see, once the water started coming in, it overtopped and overtook all of this debris. Here's some fishing boats. Small footprint structures like this microwave tower, you see they still stand because the water flows through the foundation. They don't generally are affected. But all these houses were lifted up by buoyancy forces and then affected by the tsunami itself. There's a number of microwave towers and trees. It shows you the massive amount of flooding that takes place. And what's uncommon is that, or not uncommon, what's unusual is this flooding hazard has fires associated with it. So here you are flooding and a fire breaks out. About half of the damage in Japan from tsunamis has been due to fires that burned following a tsunami. This little clip shows the tsunami approaching a small community north of Sendai. And I want you to just watch the destruction of this whole community as the tsunami approaches the shore. Inside of the city, Kanaichi City, which was flooded. See, this wooden structure was just picked up and carried down the street. What you won't see in this water are people. The Japanese evacuated. They knew what to do. Like I said, the best prepared country for tsunamis. the main point is it's a flooding hazard. You have to deal with the flood. The earthquake shook these buildings, but they didn't fall down from the earthquake. They fell over or were destroyed by the tsunami. Most of the homes that we saw, I was there in February of this year, most of the homes we saw, you can clearly see that they had been built according to earthquake codes. They all survived the earthquake. They didn't survive the tsunami. Now I'd like to take this down to a more personal level. What I just showed you was in an attempt to educate you so that you will heed any tsunami warning, or if you're on a beach somewhere in a remote location, if you feel the earth shake, you'll take off. But there's a video clip that I'd like to show you from a movie called Hereafter that's based on an actual flooding from the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And this is in parts of India, and then we'll clip over to another area. See, these people were trapped. They didn't understand to evacuate. They didn't have any evacuation plan. There was no warning system in place. This is in Phuket, Thailand, where I want you to pay attention to this balcony and how a movie producer took this video clip and then converted it into a movie. But this is the advantage. In Hollywood, they can film you underwater, and it's clear water. All this debris that you saw from tsunamis is opaque. You know, you couldn't survive in that water. You couldn't see through it. But Hollywood's going to give some insight to this. So I want you to now try to think that you're in a movie theater and you're going to experience a tsunami, okay? Now in this movie, our heroine and hero are separated. She's over here shopping, and he's in the fourth floor of that hotel. Now we're going under it. The encounter's her first obstacle, and she's in good shape. We don't want you to be this person. Okay. Have I convinced you don't want to be in this now? All right, we're on our way. Okay. Now, more technical, scientific aspects. How often do tsunamis occur? Well, one damaging tsunami per year causes death worldwide. They're frequent. Everybody thinks they're rare events, but they're not. They're rare in any location, but not necessarily globally. 5 measurable tsunamis a year. For the research community, this is a boon because we get to measure tsunamis and study them. Where do they occur? All fatal tsunamis occur. All tsunamis, just about everywhere in the coastline of the world, especially the Mediterranean, the Pacific Rim, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean, especially in the eastern part of the Indian Ocean. If you look at the local regional subset of all tsunamis, you'll see that it follows the same pattern. Had a large one over here in Lisbon, Portugal in 1755. But ocean-wide tsunamis are not so frequent. And that's the ones that we just experienced in 2011 and 2004, where they were global in their reach. So, how are they generated? Well, most seismologists and geologists have come up with this sort of picture, an oversimplified picture where a subducting plate goes under an overlying plate, and over time, this plate builds up lots of stress, and when that stress is released, it's it's vertical, and it generates a wave like that. So the most common way to generate a tsunami is shallow undersea earthquakes, but that's not the only way. There's underwater or subaerial landslides. They're less common, but oftentimes the earthquake will trigger a slump. So you get the combination of earthquake and slump. And that, in 1998, Papua New Guinea, 2,000 people were killed by that event. There was almost no shaking. Volcanic eruptions like Krakatoa, and then the granddaddy of all meteors hitting the ocean. We hope we never experience that. So the next part of sort of this taxonomy of tsunamis is classification. A local tsunami, you feel the earthquake, it's a natural warning, tsunami will rise in a minute. You will not have a warning system warning. So if you're vacationing somewhere in the beach, you feel the earth shake, take off. High and inland, as fast as you can. You don't need a warning center to tell you anything different. If you don't have a tsunami, well, you've got a little exercise. So, distant tsunamis. You won't feel the earth shake, but you'll see the sea level changes. You will hear a roar from the ocean, if you remember that movie, Loud Roar was coming from the ocean. But you'll receive an official warning from NOAA that says the tsunami is on its way. It arrives in something like hours. So those are the 2 different types of tsunamis, and I'll talk about the distant tsunami problem and the local tsunami problem. So now let's go into U.S. policy. Tsunami risk in the U.S., we have 2 types of earthquake tsunami risk, and that's subductions on earthquakes. Those are the big ones. And the subductions on Alaska, Cascadia, Puerto Rico, and Tonga. Slides can occur in the same locations, except for Southern California is also prone to underwater landslides that are triggered by earthquakes. And the East Coast and Gulf of Mexico, they all have the potential for underwater landslides triggered by earthquakes. If you look at a map of plate tectonics, you'll see the major regions, Alaska, Cascadia, the Caribbean, and then more recently we've had them over here in American Samoa in 2009. 1964 Alaskan tsunami in Hawaii. Everyone remembers this great photograph. Our tsunami observer scientist was killed in this 1946 tsunami that led to the creation of the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Honolulu. 1964 Alaska tsunami. You can see all the inundation from the snow melt. That led to the creation of the Alaska Tsunami Warning Center in 1969. And we don't have any headlines from the 1700 Cascadia earthquake and tsunami. So we have to depend on another source of information, and that's your friend mud, So all geologists like to muck around in the mud, and so what they did is they took cores, and this is from Crescent City, California, where you can clearly see the sand deposit from the 64 tsunami and the 1960 Chilean tsunami. And then if you go back to 1700, this is the headline for the 1700 in the sand. So we do have geological evidence that such an earthquake took place. And by the way, this is the deposits that are also found in Japan. It was used to chronologically date these massive earthquakes. In 2009, we had 200 people die in American and Samoa. This red area along the coastline shows what was inundated, what was flooded. Before this tsunami, this area was considered to be a low-risk area for tsunamis. And after 2009, it became a high-risk area. So this gets back to my original comments about actuarial tables. If you have no data, you have no tsunamis, then there's not a problem. Well, that's not so. You have a problem, but you just don't have the time scale to put it in perspective. So that brings me to risk versus vulnerability. Risk is actuarial, like I described. You gotta have enough events, you can quantify them, and you can probably make a fairly accurate prediction. If you have few events, you cannot. So, but if you talk about risk without talking about vulnerability, because vulnerability is what you actually experience, that's the actual thing that happens to you. I'd like to illustrate that by a Caribbean problem. In 1867, a 20-foot tsunami occurred in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. And the ship was grounded by the tsunami and is well documented. Okay, so that's a risk. 1867, doesn't happen very often, but this is the vulnerability. The same port today, there's 6 cruise ships here with a total population of about 25,000 lives. So this is the risk from an actuarial perspective. This is the vulnerability if it happens. I could put up a similar photograph of Southern California. I could put up in 1812, we had a tsunami that flooded Santa Barbara, went about a third of a mile inland, deposited a trading ship. But if I took a picture of Santa Barbara now, it would look like that. So the vulnerability keeps growing. The risk is about the same, but the vulnerability keeps growing because we keep moving closer and closer to the coastline. Okay, so that's our risk. That's our vulnerability. It's growing because people are migrating to the coastline. What really impacted our policy, though, in the U.S. wasn't these data from past tsunamis, because everybody said it's not a big problem. It was this Indian Ocean tsunami. Nobody had expected a tsunami to kill this many people. 227,989, damage of about 13 billion, but it displaced 1 million people. 1 million people. This is hard to comprehend. Whole communities were wiped out. Teachers, schoolhouses, whole infrastructure wiped out. They have to rebuild from scratch. This woke up the U.S. because the U.S. spent about $1 billion helping in recovery. Let me repeat that, $1 billion. We spent about $250 million for Operation Unified Assistance, where we sent 24 ships over there, including the hospital ship, to help rescue and recovery operations. And we helped rebuild 5 countries: Indonesia, Thailand, India, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. We made great inroads. This was a wonderful thing from the perspective of U.S. help, but there was a civil war going on here. So we, the U.S., had to fly all, couldn't leave our troops on the ground every night to fly back to the ship, every night. So the expense went way up. Okay. So now you have to say, okay, the tsunami happened somewhere in the world. I don't know if you recall that Boxing Day event, December 26, 2004, but there was a time of the year when it was slow news, and this was on the news for about 2 weeks, this tsunami, all the recovery. And remember, there was some pressure on the U.S. Why isn't the U.S. chipping in more money for the recovery and rescue operations? So, there's a cost. A net result of this was that the senators from the West Coast, Dan Inouye, Ted Stevens, and Maria Cantwell, decided that we needed an act. So the 2006 Tsunami Warning Education Act was passed, had 4 parts. It asked NOAA to take care of, it had a mitigation component, including the states that are affected, FEMA and NOAA. It had a tsunami warning component, including NOAA and the USGS, a tsunami research component, including NOAA and NSF, and an international cooperation, including NOAA and USAID. This was the first law that was passed specifically for tsunami problems. And as a result, there's been lots of progress. There's a program called Tsunami Ready, and I think we have a representative here today who's actually helping La Jolla become a Tsunami Ready community. So we ought to applaud this gentleman, John. Please stand up and show your community that you're involved in it.
It's a lot easier doing community outreach meetings after the Chilean and then, of course, the Japanese earthquake. But when we tried to roll it out at first, you know, just putting signs up here on La Jolla Shores to Ocean Beach, it was difficult to convince people it was worthwhile. But as Dr. mentioned, it just became so obvious that people pretty much accepted, hey, you live in a coastal area, we have an inundation zone, so the awareness is really raised in the community. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. So in addition to that, the United States is moving smartly out. Put up tsunami signs, showing evacuation routes. There are shelters. Hazard maps is the big thing. I like to show this one from Hawaii because it's online. You can type in your address and see whether you're in or out of the evacuation area. This brown area is what to evacuate in the event of an evacuation being called. And so the states are working hard. They have notification systems up, outdoor sirens, emergency alert. It comes through weather radio, all these warnings. So the United States is not sitting still. It's moving ahead. Another aspect of this, and the warning side, was the development of a technology that originated here at Scripps with Walter Monk and a long time ago. Gaylord Miller, I studied under Gaylord, where the idea is that you put a sensor on the seafloor that can detect a tsunami, and back up here, space. And then this tsunami, this sensor can detect as an earthquake occurs, it can detect a tsunami and send the information back acoustically, then through a satellite to our warning centers in Hawaii, Alaska, and our operations center in Bay St. Louis. Now this technology was something that people, oceanographers, had thought of many, many years ago, but the technology wasn't available until recently. So the first of these was operationally tested in 2003. So in 2003, we had captured our first tsunami using this technology, and now by February 20th, 2012, there are approximately 54 of these detectors in the world's oceans. And many countries are now buying these from a company manufactured right here in San Diego, SAIC. And we have Rob Lawson to thank for having this success. But the same technology that was built in the U.S. and licensed and now built commercially, all of these triangles that are not red are other countries. Australia is yellow, Chile is purple, Indonesia, Thailand, India. And by the end of this year, it's projected there'll be 60 of these stations out in the world's oceans, 20 of which will be paid for by other countries, 40 by the U.S. So this is a popular technology that other countries are embracing, especially, and the most recent purchase is by Japan. Japan just bought 6 to put off their shore. And so if we play our cards right, we may be able to save our money. This one here in yellow is owned by Russia, and I'll show you how that played out in the most recent tsunami. So, on March 11th, last year, March 11, 2011, these are the 4 buoys that were closest to Japan. 3 of them U.S., 1 of them Russian-owned. And here's the earthquake epicenter. And the first buoy to detect this was a U.S. buoy, showing that the tsunami was about 1.64 meters. That was a huge tsunami in the deep ocean. The second one was a Russian buoy, which showed it was about half that size. And based on the data from these two, we were able to do in an experimental mode, we're able to do a projection of what the tsunami would look like based on the inverting these two signals. And using pre-computed unit sources, sort of like Green's functions, determined that the area that was affected was about 400 kilometers. And then we running the model forward, we didn't match the next two, so it showed the grid constraint of that model. And if you were to look at this source, the tsunami source, from the ocean, if you looked at it from space, it would look like about a 10-meter uplift on this side and a 3-meter drop on the other side. So it's a dipole. It's like this, the drop on this side, uplift on this side. Based on those data from a dart buoy and about 1 hour after the tsunami, after the earthquake started. So here's the propagation of that model, of that tsunami, and hitting the first buoy within 30 minutes, and the second buoy within an hour. Based on the data from those two, models were used to forecast what was going to happen to the U.S. about 5 hours before it struck Hawaii. And so you can see as the tsunami propagates out, it encounters all this underwater topography, reflection, refraction, it gets this very complicated wave pattern. By the hour 9 hours after the earthquake, it was hitting the west coast. It hit at low tide, so there was some strong currents in some harbors, but very little flooding. Didn't cause any extensive damage like it did. Hawaii flooded. The forecast was for flooding in Hawaii. This is a simplification of that complex wave pattern. It takes the maximum amplitudes and plots them. And you can see these pathways, long pathways all the way across the ocean that are created by the underwater topography. It steers the energy to these different locations. If you follow some of these paths, you'll see that the tsunami was bigger at those locations where the red areas indicated it would be. And so at a glance, we could see that this tsunami was going to create not much problems along the west coast, but flooding in Hawaii. And this is an example of what the forecast was for Kahului, Hawaii. And this is the town's Google map showing that this is the flooding area, all this color area. And so this was not going to be extensive, but the entire harbor of Kahului was flooded. An aerial overflight the following morning, because it arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning and there was it was too dark to take any photographs of the tsunami actually flooding Kahului, but at first light, the state of Hawaii sent up a helicopter to fly over this affected area. And here we are at this point right here. You can see that the water's still standing there after 3 in the morning. It's not damaging flooding, but it is flooding. And you can see over here, by the time the survey teams got in here, all that water had evaporated. So it was great that we had this video of this tsunami flooding in that early morning. This is to illustrate that the technology of using, and then of showing that by using the actual tsunami observations in the deep ocean, you can forecast what the coastline is going to flood. And remember, Kahului had this evacuation map in brown. And for this event, this was a flooding area. Fortunately, the state of Hawaii called an evacuation. Everybody left this area, and nobody died. That was a good use of this information. So the technology shows you can actually predict the forecast. You can predict the flooding forecast 5 hours before it arrived in Hawaii. So, I think it's safe to say that the Tsunami Warning Education Act did a lot of good stuff. So we're moving ahead. Well, one of the provisions of that act was that it should have a review. And John Orcutt, who's in the audience today, led a team of people and wrote a report that was issued in January of 2011. January 2011, okay? And his recommendation from this team of people who worked together for about 2 years, is that right, John, about 2? About 2 years. Yes. Key finding: we're not ready for local tsunami. And guess what happened 2 months later? the biggest local tsunami in the history of our world, the Japanese tsunami. So we don't want John writing more reports. That's okay, but 2 lessons learned from this event that I think are really critical. Tsunamis are a local problem, hence Tsunami Ready. It's a local problem. Education, preparedness, and exercise are essential to save lives. You've got to practice. You live in a vulnerable place, you have to be able to get out. But local governments need tools to assess the hazard and warn people. You can't do it by yourself. This is too complicated, too important to leave it to local jurisdictions. And I'll give you an example of that a little bit later. So now what I'd like to study is this technology that we use to forecast the flooding for Honolulu, Hawaii, worked so well, we decided to try it out on a local tsunami. So this is a hindcast. This wasn't done in. And remember, I showed you this this animation at the beginning of the talk. You're going to see it again, but I want you to keep your eye on this one gauge. There was one GPS Japanese gauge, and watch this yellow, this green ball as it goes over. Now the black is the observations, the red is the numerical model. As the tsunami goes over this gauge, it tracks fairly well the time sequence that was observed offshore. And then, at the same time, it was constrained by the flooding. We know from observations how much was flooded. So we would constrain the model 2 ways, offshore and onshore. There's little examples, a few examples in oceanography where you can have such constraints on models because the data just does not exist. Okay. So what we then did was compare the actual flooding, which is indicated by the white line, and the blue is the flooding model example. And this is a blow up again. This box represents a blow up of this area, and this box represents a blow up of this area. In fact, about 200 square miles were flooded in Japan. 200 square miles. This model predicted within 15% accuracy how much area would be flooded. It overestimated the flooding by about 15%. From a warning perspective, that's what you'd like to see. You'd like to see your models over-predict. So this is very encouraging because if we had, I'll show you in a minute. So taking the same technology and knowing that one of our big problems is the Cascadia subduction zone in the Pacific Northwest, apply the same approach again, only this time probably the most popular scenario for our coastline would be a Sumatra-style earthquake. That is like happening in the Indian Ocean. It'd be 1,000 kilometers long. And then we're going to show you a blow up of this area as it floods a part of Washington State. And then here's the time up here. So you'll see the time sequence. And here's the actual coastline, Long Beach and Ocean Shores. And these are sand spits that are very low lying. So here we go with the big earthquake off the Cascade. This is the scenarios. So you can see, just like we did before, about 30 minutes it starts flooding the coastline, overtops the sand spit. But unlike Japan, there's not the reflected waves that we saw. So it's going to be the initial wave is going to be the difficult one to deal with, according to this simulation. If we take that same result and we plot it for our entire coastline, there are areas where it will be up to 40 meters. In Oregon especially, it will be hardest hit, Oregon. When you get down to south of Point Reyes here in California, it drops off very quickly. Not much flooding that's going to take place in Southern California, but Northern California, Oregon, and Washington will be hard hit. Now in this area, if you take this flooding estimate, and it's about on the order of like happened in Japan, about 200 square miles will be flooded. There's more than 200,000 people that live in this area. And Japan, which is the most tsunami-prepared country in the world, lost about 5% of the population that was at risk. If we extrapolate what 5% of 200,000 people are, it's a big number. We lost 3,000 people in 911. We lost 1,000 people in Katrina. How would our society feel about losing that many people? If you take 5% of 20,000 people, it's a big number. So as a society, we have to ask ourselves some questions about how much, because you've got to understand, Japan is grieving, and to the extent that we grieved after 9/11. In fact, Japan calls us 3/11. That's where they refer to the tsunami. And although we can talk about numbers and science, we have to think about emotionally how we as a society will accept it. I'm not trying to be scare tactics here, folks. I'm just trying to say we know that this is possible. And we need to prepare our citizenry for the obvious. That's what I mean by untold human pain and suffering. Japan has to live with 20,000 people die. After all of the investments they've made in this technology, all the investments they've made in preparedness, all the investments they've made in training people, they still have to live with that test. So, what to do? Well, first of all, let me say the system has worked, because we haven't had a big tsunami yet, okay? And we're learning from other countries. That is, the Indian Ocean tsunami led to the Tsunami Act. It's a 5-year policy experiment, okay? We got out and did some good things. In fact, progress has been made on tsunami detection, warning, preparedness, and hazard assessment. Good stuff, okay? Good to have a policy. The category review identified a major deficiency. Thanks to John. Here we are. Okay, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Well, we have a system in place. We have the Tsunami Act. It's a representation. So, like anything else you do in life, you try for a while and you make some adjustments. So that's why I'm saying the system works. We have an opportunity to make some adjustments. So I suggest that we start to establish technical standards, especially for hazard mapping, education, preparedness, and mitigation. And maintain these standards with oversight committees, because this is highly technical stuff that needs to be set up in order for the local communities to have the support they need and the tools they need to do their jobs. Let me show you a very sad map. Remember the evacuation map I showed you of Kahului? And if you remember the brown area, for these two places in Okanado and Sendai City, the blue was the evacuation area before the tsunami. The 2011 tsunami flooded up to the red line. Now they actually put tsunami evacuation shelters in this area. There were 31 cases where people died in tsunami shelters. Okay, Japan has to live with this. This is a global problem. Now, you ask yourself, why did this happen? Well, Japan's asking themselves that question right now. And I would argue that the reason they did it was because there's no standards. There's no best practices for how to do a hazard map. So every community went about it the only way they wanted to do it. Nobody said, this doesn't meet the good housekeeping seal of approval. Let's just do it. Imagine if you were in an evacuation shelter and suddenly you were drowned. You would be pretty mad at your government. You'd probably come back in a reincarnated state and say, we're going to get even, or something like that. Emergency management shelter. Look at that. This is where the people were going to issue commands. 22 people died in this. Guy climbed up on the top of this mast and he was saved because he got up high enough. Look at that. Well, one other thing they do in Japan, which we do not do in the U.S., is build these huge structures that are supposed to protect you from the tsunami. Well, the tsunami overtopped this thing and wiped out everything behind it. Look at the size of this. It took them 40 years to build this with local money. Again, there were no practices, no standards. How high should this thing be? How big should it be? Nothing. Everybody doing it their own way. So, the second thing I would suggest is that our tsunami warning products are pretty confusing. And I think that it's time that we realize that the world is actually going to this kind of technology, okay? I suspect most people in this room have a phone that they can receive an image on. But more importantly, I think our warning program has to develop products for ports and harbors. So far, we focused most of our activities on residents, people who choose to live near the coast. Let's evacuate or something like that. What about people that work on the docks? That's where they earn their living. They don't have a choice of where they go to work every day. But we offer no product. For right now, in Port of San Diego, the Coast Guard is charged with evacuating ships. They have no information about whether they should evacuate a ship or not. It's a cost. And in 2010, there's a pretty strong currents in San Diego harbor. And you've got some pretty interesting vessels in this harbor. So I would suggest that we start to go to flooding products because people can understand this. It's pretty easy to look at a Google map and say, okay, this brown area is what you're supposed to evacuate. Maybe some emergency managers may want to know exactly what the forecast is, but everybody should know this. In fact, we should get Google to put this on every community where we have evacuation. So you can look it up online. But you can be sent out, In fact, if any of you are entrepreneurs, there might be some business here that would tell you, gee, you're in a tsunami evacuation area, head north on whatever it is. I'm sure that can be done. I just hope somebody's entrepreneurial enough to take it and run with it. So then you can deliver it to your favorite iPhone. International cooperation, I think we have to develop these international warning products based on U.S. science and technology, because quite frankly, we're in the lead right now. We've been in the lead since we started using tsunami data to our forecast. I think as a global citizen, you're entitled to a warning whether you're in Italy, Sri Lanka, the Caribbean, or here in California. Wouldn't it be nice if everywhere you went, the same product showed up? I mean, this is possible. It's possible because we're using the same detection technology. If it were accepted globally and the software that's already been developed by the U.S. could be used internationally, you could do that. All these products could be the same and delivered the same way. Okay? It's not that difficult. We live in a global community and we should be thinking of global products. Right now, there are 4 warning systems under development. And the Pacific is the most mature, but the Caribbean's just spinning up. The Northeast Atlantic and Mediterranean, they have yet to put a warning system together after 2004. But the Indian Ocean, as you saw Monday, did a pretty good job of saying that magnitude 8.6 earthquake did not generate a massive tsunami and nobody died. Oh, well, a few people died, but that was from heart attacks and other unrelated things. So, but from the tsunami, there wasn't a big enough tsunami to kill anybody. Okay, so before my last slide, I'd like to open the floor for some questions. Yes.
When you showed the flooding map, what was that based upon? Was it based upon a generic algorithm, or was it based upon that particular event?
Which part of the flooding map? You're talking about the brown area?
Brown area of Kahului.
The brown area?
Yes.
That was based on numerical modeling done by the state of Hawaii, based on previous tsunamis, mainly. And so they combined all the previous tsunamis and made a map of what they expected to be maximum inundation for Kahului.
How much of that's been done to the West Coast?
Well, right behind you is Rick Wilson, who finished in California. So he could field questions. Rick, I think the whole coastline of California's been mapped, right? I mean, the major cities.
Yeah, we have 50% of the coastline mapped, which is all the low-lying populated areas. So we do have that mapped. We did that in 2009. We're looking back at what happened in Japan, to determine if these maps are good enough. But right now, we feel they are. So, and they're available to communities to use for evacuation planning, which we try to standardize. And I have one question for you.
Yes.
Regarding your comments about, coming up with a set of standards
Yeah.
and guidance, that's a great comment and a great question. And the one group that you did mention in your talk, as far as I could tell, was the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, which is a collaboration between state and federal agencies.
Right.
And we've developed guidance and protocol for evacuation planning, maps, inundation maps. It's a very difficult thing to have everybody on the same page because it is a local community decision to make on evacuation planning.
Right.
But we are trying to address all these issues that you
Okay.
brought up, and especially the maritime community too. We found that 2010 was a very important year for us as a starting point of determining we had problems in California from that. So we've been trying to develop those products too. So my question would be to you is, there is a program in place to do this.
Well, I would just simply report back that, John's 200, 300-page report pointed out what I thought was some excellent recommendations, and that is acknowledging that NTHMP is working on this. I would say the only flaw in this plan right now is there doesn't seem to be any oversight to the process to adjudicate differences with states, because the NTHMP doesn't try to force anything on anybody. I think there has to be more rigorous oversight of this process, and that would require a team of technical experts who are outside of the funding group. And that's one of the recommendations made by John's team, was that you have these oversight committees that are independent, so they can exercise real review, if you will. And I think that's what's missing in the process right now. Okay, is there any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, how are people thinking about getting all of this advanced knowledge into the hands of community leaders in developing countries?
Well, there's and on the international scene, there's the United Nations has a program called UNESCO, the United Nations Educational and Cultural Science Organization. And within UNESCO is a body called the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. And it's through that body that they have formed these 4 regional teams. They serve as a coordinator. They have no authority, no regulatory. But much to my surprise, because I was involved in the Indian Ocean tsunami warning system development, much to my surprise, they use peer pressure among countries to help develop these things. And in the Indian Ocean, the 2 countries that rose to the leadership positions were Australia and India. It's a matter of national pride. They wanted to be able to warn their neighboring countries of the threat. And it's worked surprisingly well. Both of them have adopted U.S. technology and installed it in the Indian Ocean. And I would say, in some respects, the Indian Ocean warning system is probably superior to the Pacific system, because they've already incorporated some of these things I've already talked about. Well, we're still dealing with legacy issues in the Pacific about the old way we used to do business. For example, Japan didn't use any tsunami data in their forecast, just seismic data, because they haven't incorporated it yet. But they will now. Their new plan is to incorporate tsunami data into their forecast. So the Indian Ocean is using it right now. From day one, they started using tsunami data to do their forecast. But I think it's really quite remarkable. I had my doubts why, if you had an Indian Ocean and you had multiple people issuing warnings, how are they going to sort all this thing out? Well, it's sort of like competition, you know. People will trust the best product. And if India starts putting out bad products, they'll better pay attention to them. Australia puts out bad products, they'll better pay attention to them. So there's a sort of competition going on who's going to put out the best product. And surprisingly, they're very close. They're very close. Yes.
Has there been any effort to use some of that data gain from Japan to try to project where the debris field is likely to go?
That's a good question. And there's a lot of oceanographers in this room who probably can answer that question better than I can. But I think that, you know, it's drifting across the ocean, up in the Gulf of Alaska, to shot down a sank ghost ship, so it's coming. Senator Inouye, I understand, and Senator Cantwell from Washington are working to try to get some more investment of tracking the debris field. And they're also trying to especially Senator Inouye's office is trying to discuss with Japan, perhaps cost sharing in the cleanup. So those are some actions that are being taken by these senators. They're not sitting still. But that's all I can report. The technical side of it, I can't address right now, because I'm not. Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Sorry.
I'm not a scientist, but it seems in looking at the pictures that in low-lying areas with big populations and no warning, the best thing to do would be have tsunami-resilient buildings. And I noticed that some of them stood and some died. Do they know why? Some stood and some didn't, like the airport stood. And have they done studies on that?
Well, yeah, there have been quite a few studies on that. In fact, FEMA and NOAA put out some guidelines for tsunami-resilient buildings. And then up in the northwest, where this area I showed you that's going to be flooded in 30 minutes from Cascadia, those communities are addressing this in a big way. There are several models that they're following. One is a tsunami tower. Another is a tsunami berm, which you could build a parking lot into the berm. There are various aspects of this thing, but I think what Tohoku event showed us was that should be the last resort. You should really get out of harm's way because nobody knows how high the tsunami's going to be. You know, they built that emergency building with the expectation that the tsunami wouldn't overtop it. It did. So, you know, again, a tsunami shelter, to some extent, gives you a false sense of security. And let me give you an example. There was, in the same community, there was an educational program that was teaching the school children to be aware of the situation. I mean, this is a good idea to maybe go to the shelter, but if you think it's going to get worse, you head another 100 yards and go up the hill. Well, a group of elementary and middle school children did just that. They could see that the water was still coming, so they just headed on up. A lot of people stopped at the evacuation building and stayed there and drowned. And this is so sad. You say, how did that happen? Well, because they've been trained to go to that area instead of trained to think. You know, this may not happen. This may not be right. I mean, everybody's telling us this stuff, but it's estimates. It's not precise. So let's be aware. So I think in the survival game, the most important element is cunningness, cleverness, resourcefulness. And that's what you have to train people, like in the tsunami awareness, Tsunami Ready. It's not just about to go to this evacuation site, but go to the evacuation site, look at the situation, and then make more decisions. You know, that's what we have to do. We have to teach people to think, not just do it because the government told you to do it.
And the reason I'm asking this,
Yeah.
and they pointed this out in a television show, but in a low-lying place like Pacific Beach in
Yeah.
San Diego,
Okay.
there aren't good roads to get out. It's
Okay.
traffic jammed all the time.
You have to go out foot.
Very little warning. What do you do?
Yeah. Well, you'd be surprised when you're when the adrenaline rush, how far you can go in 30 minutes. And I advise all of you, if you live in such areas, you regularly practice this. And then, I also advise you to practice it at night without a flashlight. And now imagine anything that can fall over and get in my way, it would. So how are you going to get over those things? So think, this is what the practice of going to an evacuation site isn't just to go in an ideal situation. Try to think of what's the worst case scenario and how you can deal with it. If you think about it in advance, take your family for a little stroll out and then say, okay, let's imagine this telephone pole fell down. What are we going to do? Let's imagine there's a power line live. What are we going to do? Those kind of things. I mean, I'm not trying to scare people, I'm just trying to say, think what can happen. You see all this stuff, they weren't ready, they were ready, but they weren't really ready. You see the difference? You can be ready, but don't take everything, and remember, these are all estimates. These are all estimates. We don't know. I mean, like I said, the risk that we know about has large uncertainty. So people start telling you it's going to happen this way. Well, possibly. Okay. Yes?
So you started to answer my question, but I'd like a little information. I mean, is the state of prediction at the point where we knew what the magnitude of the earthquake was, then our model would give us an accurate prediction? Or is the uncertainty in the predictor itself? How do you determine sort of a level of risk? I mean, it's easy to tell people, well, just go run uphill.
Yeah.
But it's not that practical, depending upon the speed of the person and the tidal wave coming on the beach, right?
Well, I think tomorrow I'm giving a talk before the Seismological Society of America, and I'll address this problem. Tsunamis, nobody quite knows how tsunamis are generated. I mean, there's an association between earthquake and tsunamis, but the details are not well understood. And if I showed you a plot of earthquake versus tsunami intensity, I didn't turn that thing off. Yeah, I don't. Okay. You would find that you can't rely on that alone, because there are many examples of magnitude 8 earthquakes generating no tsunami. But the state of the art right now, let me just say, to condense this down to a very short concept. The state of the art today is if you feel the earth shake, take off. Don't wait for anything. Within 30 minutes, for the next 4 or 5 years, within 30 minutes, you'll have a flooding forecast to say, how much of my land would be flooded. Meanwhile, presuming you're in a safe area. But as soon as you get into that safe area, what's the first thing you want to know? What's happened, right? How do you get information? Well, probably the most distributed communication system we have are these guys. Okay, do our emergency shelters have satellite communication so that we can get information when all our cell towers go down?
And radio.
And radio. Okay. So this is the kind of thing you need to be thinking about. How will you deal with getting information once you're in this situation? Because, as I played out the scenario, I said, okay, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, it's dark, everything's fallen down, power's out, I'm up in the evacuation area. Now what? Should I go back and save, the $600 items I have there? Of course not. But should I just pack up my car and go visit my sister because I don't have a community to go back to for the next 6 months or next 3 months? Those are basic questions in which the forecast system that we've come up with, there are physical limitations on sizing an earthquake, forecasting a tsunami. And it goes something like this. The first 30 minutes, you feel the earth shake, you take off, wait for further notice. After 30 minutes, information will start coming in. Maybe earthquake information, it may be tsunami information. But that first 30 minutes is basically when you have to say to yourself, I want to survive, I'm going to take off. I'm not going to ask, I'm not going to wait. Because you need to understand, nobody's going to provide you with adequate information in that first 30 minutes. So it better be safe than sorry. Take off and hope for the best.
So there's no hope for, say, an altimeter providing empirical information, which would be a better predictor than just the magnitude of the earthquakes?
Well, again, I would recommend you not necessarily relate the earthquake, except that it's shook the land, okay? And that's your warning, okay? And, most people, you'll find people, some communities will say, if you feel the earth shaking last for 60 seconds, so you're down underneath your desk, holding on to your legs, you duck, covered and held, and then you count to 60. 1001, 1002. If it's still shaking after 60 seconds, that's no doubt, it's a big earthquake. Okay? That's what the kind of common sense things that we have to deal with, okay? Yes, sir.
Getting back to the local area here, maybe somebody here at Scripps knows the answer to this, but offshore, we've got about 80 miles of mountains and valleys under the ocean. And we've been told that these will protect us from big tsunamis coming all across the ocean from Japan, that type of thing. But the fact is, those valleys are thousands of feet deep, some of them are filled with sand, and the mountains, the underwater mountains or shoals, those are created by earthquakes. And I'm just wondering if something like the San Clemente Island fault drops 5 feet in 20 miles of it, that would be a very local event. Would it create a big tsunami?
Well, the most dangerous of these types of earthquakes are the subduction zone ones, and that there's not a subduction zone off the coast here. But there are earthquakes that there are, you know, you're right. We don't know. I think the answer is we don't know, but based on the very, very short history we have, and it's a geological record, I think the biggest cause is the earthquake triggering a landslide for this area, being a big tsunami. And that would probably be the same way. Look, I think we've run out of time. There's a reception, right? So we can answer a few more questions, but I do want to get to my last slide. So if you don't mind, could you hold off, and I'll talk to you at the reception. So before you leave, I want you to take away, I get the last word, right? So Tsunami Act, okay. So somebody said, hey, how should we rewrite this act? So Eddie Bernard says, I've got some ideas, okay. Education and mitigation, I think you have to establish, maintain, and enforce standards. You've got some communities up and down our coastline that have decided that they like different words. This is going to lead to confusion. We have a very migratory population. We move up and down the coast either for vacation or we move because we want to relocate. We've got to standardize these things so that as you go from one community to the next, you're not confused. And I appreciate the efforts that NTHMP has done. We've got a long ways to go. Warnings. We can no longer deal with text messages. This is just abhorrent in today's society. We need graphical products that people can understand at a glance. And these need to be delivered in such a way that it's efficient. The days of getting, 2 pages of text. Let me just ask you this. How many of you read an email that's more than a paragraph? That's what I thought. I don't. Nobody else does. So are you going to wade through 3 pages of text to find out what you're supposed to do? Okay. Research. Well, research communities had it pretty easy all these years. I think it's time that they stood up and did something useful. Now the research guy. Develop standards and focus on cost containment. Not everything has to go up every year. Why don't we be clever? Why don't we invent ways to reduce cost of our operations so that we can use money for other things as we discover? In international cooperation, I think we have to develop these products quickly so that as these other regions are formulating their warning systems, they'll embrace what we have done. And then they will follow our lead. So that when you go to Italy and when you go to Greece and when you go to Sumatra, you'll get the same product. And so will other people. So that's all, folks.